Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Economist seminar. We're looking at Scope 3 climate reporting. My name is Peter Elwin. I'm the Director of Fixed Income Planet Tracker, which is a financial-focused non-profit think tank. And I'm also head of our food and land use program. And sort of the climate carbon footprint of food and land use is a topic dear to my heart, and certainly has implications for a number of the organizations that are in today's discussion. So we're hoping for a free-flowing discussion from all the august participants that we've got. I'll just quickly do the introductions, and then we'll get stuck straight into the discussion. So thank you to all my fellow panelists for joining me today. In no particular order, but I think they're broadly as you can see them on the screen. So welcome to Thomas Lingard. Thomas is Global Head of Sustainability and Environment for Unilever, which is definitely one of the sort of companies leading the charge in terms of sustainability reporting. So Thomas, thank you for joining. Delighted to have you with us. Also joined by Juliet White, who is Vice President Global of SHE. And Juliet, I've forgotten what SHE stands for, so perhaps you can enlighten me. But SHE and Sustainability for AstraZeneca. So Juliet, thank you very much indeed for joining. And what does SHE stand for?
Safety, Health and Environment, Peter.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, that's a pretty wide portfolio. We'll probably narrow it down a little bit to environment, but I know from the discussions prior to this call that you've got some sort of thoughts on how health and the other aspects integrate to conversations on environment. So it'd be interesting to see how that comes through. And Jose Francisco Vallejo Carrera from Sanofi, Global Head of Environment. Delighted to have you with us, Jose. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. And two sort of health and sort of pharma-focused companies that we've got on the panel. So it'd be interesting to sort of bring out some of those sort of peer group and sector comments that you guys can bring to the discussion. And then we are joined by Olivier Ticit. Olivier is Director of Sustainability for Musim Mas, one of the key palm oil producers based in Indonesia. So Olivier, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I know Olivier will bring some really interesting insights in terms of sort of interaction with producers on the ground, obviously a little bit closer than some of the other companies to sort of those people who are actually producing the product at the top end of the supply chain. And then finally, last but not least, delight Adam Thompson join us as well. Thank you, Adam. Global Sustainability Finance and ESG Reporting Offering Leader with IBM. And IBM is obviously doing a lot of work with a lot of companies to help them gather the necessary data, package it up, and then report it out to the markets. So thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining. Now, I wanted to kick off really just by sort of thinking about why Scope 3 reporting is so important. And just a reminder for anybody who's scratching their heads and thinking Scope 3. So we've got Scope 1, which is basically your sort of your direct climate footprint. Scope 2, which is the sort of the energy usage. And then Scope 3, which is broadly everything else, all the other sort of climate related consequences of the business. In essence, it's the sort of the footprint of the supply chain. And I thought it would be really interesting just to sort of kick off, go quickly around the table and ask you, just in broad terms, how much proportionately of your company's sort of carbon footprint comes from the supply chain itself, rather than sort of from your own direct operations. So Thomas, maybe I can kick off with you. Proportionately, what's the figure?
Well, thanks, Peter. I mean, I think in common with a lot of companies, our Scope 1 and 2 emissions are very small, maybe 2% of the full value chain. Around 60% is upstream in the raw and packaging materials that we buy. And then the rest is downstream in logistics, in customer emissions and so on.
So sort of probably heading on towards the sort of the 96, 97% as an overall score.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. So, Juliet, from Astra's point of view, what's the score on the door?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I mean, maybe just to anchor it, if I look at the healthcare sector as a whole, and that includes companies, hospitals, patients, etc., that's over 4% of global emissions. That's like being like a country, of which broadly 50% of that sits in the supply chain. If we look very specifically at AstraZeneca, over 90% of our emissions are scope 3. So kind of closer to the figures that you heard from Thomas, kind of 95, 96%. And of that, greater than 90%, about 70% is in the purchased goods and services. So you get a sense that there is really a lot to be going at there.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, and quite an interesting sort of illustration, as you say, for the healthcare sector. That that's the sort of the footprint of a reasonable sized country. So this really matters if we're going to actually tackle the sort of the climate challenge. Then there's a lot to be done. Jose, from your perspective, Sanofi, are the figures sort of similar from Sanofi, or are there any differences then?
Absolutely, are the same figures that we have in the health sector, and then, as Julie say, I will add just to say that 90% of our total emission are scope 3. Out of them, 65% are in the purchased goods, I would say. And if we go more in detail, what are the hot spots in this 65% is that the raw materials, is our active ingredients, excipients, packaging, paper, cardbox, and devices, which are the hot spot in this 75% of total emissions of scope 3.
That's really interesting, yeah, and I think again, it's interesting to see the extent to which some companies have really been able to sort of drew the granularity of whether it's coming from packaging, whether it's transport, whether it's actually the raw materials, and different raw materials obviously having a different footprint. And Olivier, I mean, you're sort of perhaps closer than some to sort of the raw material production side of things. So, what does it look like from Musimas's perspective?
Well, actually, quite close to what has been discussed so far. We have for the raw material, let's say the palm products, it's about 85+% of our total emissions. So actually quite close, and that's really very concentrated. Of course, we're a single product, we're a single commodity company, but that's in the same ballpark. Let's say 85+%.
Yes, and you raise a really interesting point, actually, that your business has a more sort of, if you like, concentrated supply chain in terms of the sort of the product spread, and it'd be interesting to explore as we go through the discussion whether that actually makes your life easier or more difficult. And I know one of the comments that you made in our sort of discussion prior to this was around the number of small suppliers in your supply chain. So that would be an interesting point to come back to. But Adam, so IBM, slightly sort of different business, but what's the sort of percentage from your perspective?
Yeah, we're in similar sort of ballpark, but exactly, we're in more of the professional services space. Obviously, if I look at consulting, and there has been the seasonality due to the pandemic in recent years, which has probably put a bit of an outlier, which has been a bit more of a reduction. Actually went down to more like the 50-60% mark. But we also have had a bit of a change of business model with the spin out of Canindril in the past 12 months. So generally speaking, similar percentage points. But that said, indeed, we have a bit of a slightly different business model to the rest of the panelists on the call.
That's an interesting point. So from your professional services sort of business, what are the sorts of things that are contributing to scope 3 for your company?
Yeah, so business travel was a huge ticket item for obvious reasons. Obviously, when we talk about the amount of commercial airlines that IBM obviously takes on an annual basis, of course, during the pandemic that reduced, but equally, that's actually something that we're trying to gamify right now to not just avoid, obviously, the travel, but looking at really what are the different alternative means for doing the hybrid business going forwards post the pandemic era. And I think the other part to also sort of say is about in the past, we really had the co-location situation with people obviously commuting to the office, et cetera, but for ourselves, we're really seeing that there's a new trend going forwards, and I think that's going to have a positive impact for us. But I can fully understand if I was in the manufacturing perspective, that would obviously still be a challenge, no doubt. I would echo certainly on the purchase goods and services, that still obviously is still valid for us as a continuation of our business model, especially with our data centers, where we obviously have co-location and the consumption of that usage. But that said, it's really to come to the exam question about how do we get into the supply chain and how do we actually get that line of sight. We still, nonetheless, for us, back in 2010, we started with clients to make sure they are aligning to science targets, and even last year going even more, let's say, aggressively on that front. So I completely understand, let's say, the percentages, but I just want one final comment from my side is about why is obviously scope 3 so important? And I think we just need to also look a little bit at the human capital instance here. It's not just a metric and a percentage point, but really when we start to look at it in terms of the broader macro implications for all of us on the call, I think it's absolutely paramount that we get even better grips and better understanding of it throughout in broader engagement, which probably is a nice segue for the next stage of the conversation today then.
Yeah, thanks. That's a sort of smooth as a DJ, Adam. That's very impressive. The question that I wanted to move on to, and Olivier, I was going to bring you in sort of first on this, is really to sort of draw out some of the key challenges associated with gathering supplier data. Because at the heart of this, obviously, if you're going to explain to the world what your Scope 3 sort of footprint is, you actually have to have the information to hand. And that involves having conversations with people further up the supply chain. And they may be quite sort of removed from your own business. But Olivier, I mean, as we've already sort of flagged, perhaps the sort of upstream end of your supply chain is a little bit closer to hand than for some of the other people on this discussion. But what are some of the challenges that you've had to grapple with looking at the palm oil industry and your supply chain?
Well, the first challenge is that expectations are very high. I think even though we might talk about net zero by 2050, expectations are already very high. So we have expectations from our customers, from other stakeholders on how we can quickly assess our Scope 3 and act on it. We've been acting on deforestation already, but now it's about Scope 3 in a much more different way. And so, yes, we are closer to the producers, but nonetheless, for our product, palm, the production is very fragmented. So you have about 40% of the area by small farmers, we're talking a few hectares, and they have very limited documentation, they have very limited connection, technical connection in the sense of assessing their emissions with the rest of the supply chain, and they're feeding into mills of various sizes, which might be standalone mills, so small businesses as well. And we have a lot of those in our supply chain. We have, on a good year, we have 500-600 mills in our supply chain directly linked to us. And these people are free economic actors. They're one day in, one day out of our supply chain. They can decide freely where they sell. So how do we capture complete and reliable data? Well, obviously, the answer is you can't. You can pretend, but you can't, definitely. And today, you certainly cannot. But is that the real problem we're facing? So no. So we have to go beyond that problem and see how can we act today? What can we do today? I think we'll touch on that later. How can we use models? How can we use proxies? Instead of just staring at the problem and just think, oh, how am I going to collect a little bit more information and a little bit more information? So I think that's what we reacted. At the beginning, we were overwhelmed by the amount of data to collect and how fluid that data was. And I think we realized, well, let's not forget why we want to do it. So let's take a step back. And yes, we will never go, it's unlikely we'll have super precise today's data available, but then how do we act on that? How do we not get overwhelmed by this problem? How do we not get staring in the lights of the car, if you want, that's approaching? And instead, how do we act? How do we find ways, smarter ways around it? There can be technology, but mostly it's about proxies, models, and how do we work with our competitors, with our peers? Peers is the polite word. Compete, what we might use on a day-to-day basis. How competitive is it to actually exchange information or to build models together?
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful insight, and the sort of not aiming for perfection when actually good is sort of good enough to get moving, I think, is a really, really important theme to explore. Juliette and Jose, I wanted to sort of come to both of you, maybe Juliette first, but you have sort of different sort of your supply chain compared to Olivier, some different sort of challenges. But I know that both of you, for example, have been using the CDP database as a sort of a core tool. But Juliette, are there sort of key messages that you've found, the key things that you've found that would be really helpful for other people to learn from?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And maybe actually to build on a couple of points that Olivier raised. If you look at the healthcare sector, and AstraZeneca is probably no different from other large pharma organizations, we have pretty complex supply chains. Those supply chains are global by nature and operate in many territories. And we have our immediate upstream supplier, and then we have the suppliers to our suppliers and the suppliers to them. And I think this expectation that Olivia mentioned is key. And that expectation is moving up. I work and have spent 30 odd years working in the healthcare sector, and there's a really clear link between climate and health, and therefore that drives a real expectation on companies such as ourselves. Being very practical, some of the things that we've done is actually ask our suppliers to begin to report on CDP data. So if we look at the sort of first 250 that we went to last year by size of relationship and spend of suppliers, to try and get better, stronger primary data through CDP. We've extended that now to 700 of our suppliers. And it is based on two things. One is that if we get stronger primary data, that's going to help all of us collectively act in a more focused way. I think, secondly, the point that Olivia made about collaboration being key. This is absolutely non-competitive to drive supply chains to more positions of lower carbon and look to decarbonise. This is one of the areas where sharing data is actually an advantage, not a disadvantage to companies. So actually engaging in CDP and those type of platforms drives better rigour of information. It kind of moves away from the paralysis or the overwhelming sort of rabbit in the headlights that Olivier referred to. But importantly, it does create shared data platforms, and that actually enables us to look for shared solutions. Again, there is nothing competitive about driving to stronger decarbonisation, and many of the solutions are actually not even industry specific, but they cut across a number of industry sectors. And therefore, when we kind of create those ripples, we create really positive ripples that others can then join in.
Yeah, thanks, Juliet. And that collaboration is I think, a really interesting theme. Jose, I wanted to turn to you and sort of see if you had things to add, either in relation to the CDP database or in terms of this concept of sort of collaborative working, both within a peer group, which would perhaps normally be regarded as competitive, but also up and down the supply chain as well. How's that working from your perspective?
Yeah, we just need to stress out what Julie said, because we have been working at sector level on that point, is alignment as well in the sector to avoid overwhelming our suppliers. So there are not only CDP, there are other platforms, and it could happen, and it's happening today, that suppliers are receiving from different pharma companies in different platforms the same request of data, which is really creating confusion, but also overwhelming the suppliers. So completely collaboration, alignment, that is key. This is something that we are progressing, but in the sector level, and we need to conclude with this first action. The second element that I would like to highlight as well, linking what Julia says, is that we have different level of maturity in our supply chain and our value chain. In terms of understanding about greenhouse gases accounting, in terms of basics, but also in terms of prioritization of the business. So we have and something also on pharma level, we're working with the PSCI, which is the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, to try to educate, to enhance the education of our suppliers, to bring them to the same level of maturity in terms of understanding of the basics, foundations, greenhouse gases accounting, but also about climate change action. So I will highlight that alignment to avoid overwhelming of the suppliers, education, try to enhance, accelerate the maturity of our suppliers in this regards.
Yeah, thank you. That education point is a really interesting one. And I was having a conversation with a company in a completely different sector to any of the ones on this call, and they were making the same point, actually, that internally, if you're looking at a large organization, you've actually got to sort of be educating the different sort of divisional heads and sort of heads of manufacturing, or whatever the nature of the business is, and really there's a very sort of strong need to bring the whole business forward, and then, as you've just illustrated, also to do that across the supply chain, when as Olivia was sort of highlighting, you could be dealing with businesses which are really remarkably sort of low tech compared perhaps to yours. They don't have the same sort of level of kit, and actually maybe they don't have the same level of awareness of the problem. And Thomas, I mean, I know you've also sort of been engaged in sort of collaborative efforts. I wondered if you could sort of expand on that a bit from the Unilever perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I mean, this excuse me, this challenge is huge, right? And like all the other companies on here, we'll have a very large and diverse global supply base. We've got, I think it's around 54,000 suppliers. But when you do the sort of Pareto analysis, you can identify the big ones. We've got about 300 where we think we've got the bulk of emissions coming from. And then you can triage those 300 into different levels of maturity, because some are, just as far along the climate journey as Unilever, and we can have very high level strategic conversations with them about decarbonisation of the value chains. But there are others who are looking at climate for the first time and are very much that sort of rabbit in the headlights. And so I think we try and classify into 3 different tiers: those who are just starting out, and then we can direct people to learning resources and many of the free tools that are available to get people started on their journey. There's a kind of middle tier where they kind of get it, they're working on it, and then we'll work with them to try and have them provide a product carbon footprint for the materials they're supplying. So we've got sort of horses for courses at different levels of maturity, and I think that's been really key for our procurement teams and our sustainable sourcing teams to be able to support and using CDP data as an indication of where people are in that journey, and the level of disclosure that people are able to provide is really helpful in that.
Yeah, thank you. And Adam, I mean, obviously you're to an extent sort of providing some of the tools and the technology to other companies to sort of help them achieve this. I mean, what are the key sort of insights that you guys have gained through what has been quite a long period of time for IBM involved in this whole area?
Yeah, for sure. And just to echo maybe some of the earlier comments, there's obviously, from the maturity of the organization that we're obviously engaging with, from literally the very pragmatic advisory approach where we have to, let's say, do a bit more hand-holding, albeit leveraging available online materials for learning and knowledge sharing, et cetera, to actually having ecosystems. And we obviously, like with others on the panel here today, are also part of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where you have platforms such as the Pathfinder, where you can actually do carbon data exchange. So I really like the comment earlier that even though we have industry peers, we don't see this as competition at all. This is really the whole collaboration there on in. And I think the biggest challenge is a data-driven challenge, but it's also what was initially supply chain by definition. You now also have the additional compliance needs. So CDP, obviously, since 1997, has been providing the capability for these voluntary disclosures. But now, if we look around the world, from whether it's the US Security Exchange Commission to EFRAG here in Europe, or the ISSB at an accounting level, you now also have different office and personas who are also needing these same data points. And it's so crucial to get as much supply or manufacturing primary data available there for the decision making throughout the organization. I think that's the other nuance to really go for, as to we're starting here building an ecosystem with network effects by everybody contributing, and whether that's on Pathfinder or other equivalent platforms. But I think the other part is to be very cognizant. This is going to only scale due to the fact that we are focused very much on climate, but biodiversity, water effluency, social, that's all the next set of data that we're going to have to start looking at, and not to go off piece, because of course today's all around scope 3. But I think that co-collaboration is exactly where this has to be heading, and getting away from manual Excels and pen and paper to really having an available ecosystem such as Pathfinder, where you can actually then share without having to reinvent the wheel in every single engagement.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really sort of helpful thought. I mean, interested, just sort of throw it open. I mean, how many of you are actually using Pathfinder tool as one example? Is anybody else on the call actually doing that? So you're nodding.
Yeah,
Thomas.
Yeah, we've been. I think we were one of the original group of companies that went to WBCSD with this challenge. That look, we're all doing LCA lifecycle analysis of our products using modeled data. This has been the standard for the last 10 years. The problem with modeled data is if you make an investment in a particular value chain, or a supplier does, it doesn't show up in your model, right? Because you're using industry standard database footprints for different materials. So we, over the next decade, shift from model to, there's no data texture, there's no common standards, there's no common definitions, there's no common platforms that allows that data to move. So when you receive an invoice, you'll know the price and the quantity. We want to know the price, the quantity, and the carbon footprint of that specific shipment, not of a generic average for that shipment anywhere in the world. And so this is a massive undertaking that WBCSD have led with, I think now 60 plus companies at the core of that, and a wider network even beyond. So it's very exciting work to have a global standard emerging for how companies can trade that data and work respecting all the confidentiality that needs to be there, but still have access to the best data.
Yeah, that's a really interesting sort of point. And as you say, it's all very well using model data as a sort of starting point, but if you actually want to affect change and you're still using models, then clearly you're not actually measuring the change that's going on. And Jose, I remember from our sort of previous sort of interactions that Sanofi has been doing a lot in terms of sort of the data analysis and the tools that you apply. I wondered if you want to sort of add your comments to Thomas's insights.
Yeah. First, in terms of primary data and a methodology, internal methodology for the scope 3, we have been working for years now to develop a robust methodology based on estimations, because this is what we already are applying as everyone, but moving from the traditional span to using additional primary data like product volumes, weights, and transportation and distance. We have put digitalization as well on the core of this, not only in terms of collecting data, but also in terms of sharing the results of this data. So we should not forget as well that the scope 3 data collection is the first step before moving to the action, because at the end, what we want to do is to create impact. We want to reduce emissions. And it is not only about myself, my department, my team. It is about many people in the company, different areas. So sharing the data, providing reports in a comprehensive way that they can visualize the data, and after defining the actions and tracking the progress, it is something that we are putting at the beginning in the specification of the developments. Another area that we are working is in terms of emission factors. We already say that we have existing data sets, where most of the cases are using not a specific product data, general, and we have identified for the hotspots, because it could be impossible today, right now, to fill out all the gap. But we are selecting the hotspots, and we are introducing the lifecycle analysis approach to try to collect data. But it's very time consuming. There is not something short term, and we are trying to modelize and to collaborate. And this is also partnering. We have discussion about collaboration with the sector level, but also we need to partner. We are starting to partner with suppliers. Suppliers start also to be concerned about the process, to understand their own by themselves. So we are already partnering with some supplier to try to have better data, not primarily the really product-specific data, and using consultants like EcoInvent, which is a good reference in the market as well, to put in all together suppliers, ourselves, and the expert company to try to accelerate the process of developing the data. And final, what I say, that this is something now on the table on the pharmaceutical sector as well, to try to partnering as well, to try to accelerate the data collection, because at the end, we are using, in most of the cases, the same raw material, the same product, and we have the same interest to generate the data, because we have every company trying to do the set that will be really 100 years to create it, and now we can find synergies as well. The only burden that we have there is about confidentiality. And this is something that we should try to be also to move faster on that, how we can break these barriers in terms of confidentiality, sharing information, sharing data, sharing process, because it could be one burden for moving faster with the data.
Yeah, thank you. That confidentiality issues is an interesting one to explore. And Olivia, I want to sort of come to you about that in a second. But Juliette, just from a sort of continuing with the pharma sector, I mean, you mentioned earlier about the need to relate to your direct suppliers, but then obviously the sort of the tiers of suppliers behind that. And I just wanted to get a bit more of an insight into how you go about actually building that picture of the whole supply chain, not just the companies that you have a direct relationship, because presumably it's essential to actually be communicating directly with suppliers further up the supply chain, rather than sort of working on a sort of whispering process going down the supply chain. How have you navigated that challenge?
Yeah, it's a great question, Peter. And I think the first thing is that the transparency of supply chains has increased radically. The expectation of being able to communicate externally, transparency, So sort of transparency map, so knowing the source and really being able to pinpoint the source of materials that are sourced by suppliers of your suppliers is the first thing. To some extent, because we're a heavily regulated industry, that actually does help. And that has driven a level of historic transparency, which helps us now as we really target the areas where we need to take action and make action. So engagement with suppliers and engagement with the suppliers of suppliers is absolutely critical. We've talked about education. We've talked about gathering data. We've talked about getting emissions factors, which are accurate. But maybe if I can just come back in the spirit of the conversation to a point that Olivia raised, is let's not let perfection be the enemy of actually making progress and taking action. So the reality is that we know there are some big sources that drive emissions, energy being one of them. And so from a collaboration perspective, across the pharma sector, we've got together to offer out to our suppliers with a third party, Schneider Electric, some solutions to actually help move to renewable energy. Now, renewable energy isn't my specialist area. I suspect most people who work in the pharma sector, it isn't their specialist area, but it is a kind of an external partner that we've worked with. And again, collaborating, you create scale, you create demand, and you create clear, strong market signals that make it valuable to invest in alternate solutions. So I think in the spirit of kind of gathering data is fantastic. Gathering upstream data is great, but acting upon it and not becoming paralyzed by wanting perfection is key. And that spirit of collaboration absolutely applies to solutions in the same way as it does to kind of sharing data and overcoming some of those data challenges.
That's a really interesting point, actually, yes, and thank you for raising that. We at Planet Track have done quite a lot of work on the textile sector, which again is not a sector represented on this call, but one of the issues there is you have a lot of companies based in developing markets where they don't necessarily have the financial resources to make the changes that are necessary. But if you're going to actually have an impact on sort of the GHG footprint of your supply chain, you need to help them. And on the challenge, going back to your point, Olivier, that you've got suppliers who can be supplying you one day and then just switch to supply somebody else because they're offered a slightly better price the next day. It's not that easy for a company further downstream to just offer support to its suppliers if you haven't got those long-term relationships and that sort of loyalty built in. So maybe this more collectivized, collaborative approach is the potential solution. And Olivia, I wanted to sort of throw that over to you because you've got these, as you were saying, very small, sometimes quite poorly resourced suppliers with relatively low tech. What's your sort of perspective on some of these points that we've just been discussing, and particularly the confidentiality point, which I know was something that you raised before the call?
Quick thing on indeed having this moving, unstable supply chain. So at least one thing that we've started to do, and we know, I know some of our competitors are doing it as well now, is to work beyond our supply chain. I think we have to do that for small farmers in particular. If we want to have an impact, we have to work beyond our supply chain and work with people regardless of the fact that they are in our supply chain today or might be tomorrow. That's a difficult thing to do. It also it's great because it gives an impact at landscape or jurisdictional level. But of course, it also means we cannot be present everywhere. We're not going to replace the state or act absolutely everywhere. And that touches actually a bit on the matter of confidentiality or data on what the information that is good to share or that can be shared. Transparency is great. I think the palm sector has worked a lot on transparency, and it's a lot more transparent than it has been ever, and it's a lot more transparent than a lot of other agricultural sectors. But we are hitting now, as we want more and more precise information, we're hitting the issue of not confidentiality, but consent. How do we gather consent? How do we make sure that all those smallholders with whom we're working and these small businesses, how do they give consent to the information they are sharing? Sometimes it can be an issue. It can be a legal issue. It can be also an issue of perception. How do they feel that we are taking the data and using it somewhere else? I think it can be sometimes unclear to them how that data gets used. And also, I think there was mentioned before, I think, Adam, you mentioned that we have to look at emissions today, but tomorrow we'll look at other things. Well, labor, human rights is another thing we have to look at. And yes, consent is an issue that we are beginning to face. How do we collect that consent? How do we maybe work around, in a way, consent, in the sense that we gather data, but we do not share that data. We share it in a different way. It's to simplify, it's what I call sharing without sharing. So how do we give you transparency further downstream without having to give you the information that we have gathered? That's a tricky debate to have, but that's an issue that we are facing when we're in contact with the producers.
Thank you. Yes, that's really interesting insights, Adam. And from a sort of systems perspective, what are some of the tools that are currently being provided to meet this sort of potential conflict between sort of sharing and not sharing, as Olivier described it?
Yeah, I mean, not to go into nuts and bolts, there obviously are technology solutions that we have in terms of different platforms. So that it allows, let's say, to provide the line of sight which is required. But if I can maybe just take a step back and to go on or to add to what Olivier was saying about, let's say, the different tiers and about their engagement and how far you want to support or push. Likewise with Juliette's comment on renewable sources. So we also have clients that we work with that provide sustainable funds to the different tiers within the supply chain, and then actually leverage that for the benefit of not just the line of sight, which is obviously very important. So we all know what the baseline is, what to work with, but also for the actual solutioning. So not the rear view mirror, but if you like, the forward-looking changes that are required to make the necessary improvements. And I think the other thing which is also very important is actually the various taxes that are coming on here from a decision making. And not to be a taxman, no one likes a taxman at the end of the day, but in this case, it's all about the decision making as to what is actually profitable and what's actually good business, what's in their essence sustainable. And I think that's the other thing that we're getting out of here in terms of the broader supply chain scope 3 discussion, as to different parts of the world are in different tempos on that particular topic. But it's very clear that that will be the core for any decision making going forwards. And I think that's the other thing that has to be overlaid with the actual emissions data that we've spoken about thus far.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting couple of points there. I mean, you've raised some huge topics. We could spend hours and hours talking about tax, talking about regulation, talking about sort of just transition, and a whole variety of things that sort of would build on the comments that you were just making. But we are sort of running up against the clock, so I just wanted to quickly go round to all the panel. Thomas, maybe if I can start with you, and just sort of very briefly, is there one key change that you'd like to see? Maybe it is more tax, maybe it is less, maybe it's regulation. What is the one key change that you think would make the biggest difference to reducing scope 3 emissions, to reducing the emissions in your supply chain? So over to you.
I think it's a mindset shift, actually. I mean, we're very locked into the scope 1, 2, and 3 thinking, but of course, everybody's scope 3 and scope 2 emissions is somebody else's scope 1. And this isn't just about a microcosmic view of an individual organization trying to get a number in a reporting sheet down from X to Y. We could do that, very easily by scooping up all the low carbon stuff and leaving high carbon stuff for other people. That wouldn't change the global trajectory to 1.5 degrees. So thinking about the things we can do collectively to get everybody's emissions down, what support needs to be provided to people emitting today that need to not emit tomorrow, I think that will help us all think about this issue. The data and the reporting is a separate sort of technical challenge on the side of that, but we all have to be engaged at the systems level in the change that needs to happen.
Thank you. That's great. So Juliette, can I turn over to you?
Partnership. And I think it's probably building on Thomas's point. We will be stronger, faster, better when we collaborate. And actually collaborating cross-sectorial is probably one of the real opportunities that we have here with the climate crisis. Supply chains are complex, but actually, if you follow things through, supply chains serve multi-industry sectors. So my personal view is, of course, we can do more within our sector, but the real size of the prize is when we collaborate across sector.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting point. Jose, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I will just elaborating about partnerships, because we say partnership with peers, we say partnership with supplier. But also, I will add something that has been mentioned before, partnership with regulators. So we are a highly regulated sector, and we have some burdens to move faster with some existing activities that we could implement already in terms of circular economy, in terms of reducing packaging. And because of that, we are now being late on moving to the action, because as I say before, Juliet, we need really not to move to the action. Some of the data is showing us the way, what we need to do. We are conducting already some action, and some of them are in hold just because we cannot do that. So partnership with regulators, I would add what has been said so far.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good way of framing it, and I think partnership with regulators is pretty essential. Otherwise, the regulators may go off and do their own thing, and that's not necessarily the sort of the optimal path. Olivier, you mentioned sort of previously. I mean, the palm oil industry's been sort of quite under the spotlight over the last sort of 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. What's the sort of the change, the key change that you would look for in terms of Scope 3 in your supply chain footprint?
Well, I would agree with Thomas, it's more of a mindset issue, but the problem is not so much the mindset of each actors, but the fact that up and down the supply chain, people share the same mindset and get to sharing the same mindset. And I think that's the point, how one end of the supply chain and the other end of the supply chain can act with the same direction. I think it sounds maybe easy, but it's actually not. I think we need much more work there, but it means more patience from downstream, action from upstream, people start doing something, realizing that it's good for business tomorrow, and that it's needed you need to start today. A small step is better than waiting for the next day. And having the support of the downstream, the end of the supply chain, so that you realize, oh wow, actually, yes, we are of the same mind here. We all can do something, and my little action actually contributes and is recognized much further downstream. It's very simple in reality. The theory of it is very simple.
Yes, that's very true. The theory is very simple, as you say. The execution is a little bit more challenging. But Adam, I give you the final word. What's the sort of the biggest sort of the shift that you would want to see in Scope 3 and supply chain footprint?
For myself, and I can only echo all the comments that have just been made, but I think just to end with, I think there's also needs to be a very strong and brave reflection on the macro level of what we're currently faced with in terms of Scope 3, and it's to be brave and yes, to have absolutely all the engagement and collaboration, but also realize what timeframes we are working against as per the IPCC's reports. And I think that's, besides what we do for as ourselves individually or as corporations, I think that's the other, let's say, slightly somber, but also reality that is the challenge. We need to work together and have really that mindset that is the runway that we're working against. And by that, I mean, by 2025, we need to have a downward spiral. We all know that in terms of greenhouse gases. So having that sense of urgency and not just mindset of like compliance reporting, I think that will really pave the way for really creating the value based on values. And that's where we need to get to.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great point to finish with. And as you say, as soon as you start sort of 2050 seems a long way off. 2025 is only 3 years away. Not so many shopping days in that year. So that's a much shorter time frame. And I think, as you say, that developing that sense of urgency, and the other theme that I think has come out from our discussion is the need, but also the real benefits that can come from a genuinely collaborative approach, and that there are ways of navigating around sort of compliance and antitrust issues, confidentiality. All of these are problems, but they're all problems that can be solved, that have been solved in a variety of situations already. And that collaborative approach is absolutely what we need to really bring it together. And as we've all been agreeing, reduce our collective carbon footprint. And it's large businesses like the ones that you represent that definitely can lead. But as Olivier was sort of highlighting, there are so many small businesses that also need to be brought into the frame and brought up to the same sort of level of enthusiasm and ability. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for a fascinating discussion. It's been really interesting to get insights from across a number of industries, and congratulations to all of you for the great work that you are doing individually and collectively within your organizations, and also very encouraging to hear the sort of the collaborations that are actually going on, particularly through other organizations like the WBCSD as well. And those collaborative efforts, I think, are absolutely essential. So it just remains to me to say thank you very much indeed for all of you for your contribution and your active participation, and the very best of luck with all your endeavors going forward. Thank you to all of you for listening as well.